All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out for this talk on Averia's very well-curated show on Ricardo Knowles' work. Just saying, I really, really enjoyed it personally. We were talking about that earlier. So we're going to start with introductions, then get straight into the questions. We'll have about an hour for our discussion, and then hopefully half an hour for questions from you. So I'm Natalie Willis Whylly. I am a curator, writer, prodigal artist. I worked in the National Art Gallery for about 6.5 years, and I've been working independently since I left about 2 years ago. And I'll let my panelists introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm Simone. I'm also a curator, also a writer. I'm mostly an art historian. I've been working between Montreal, Massachusetts, and Nassau for the past 5 years. So, yeah, that's me.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jodi Minnis. I am a writer, visual artist, and the curator at Turn Gallery, but I also curate independently as well.
Good stuff. All right, I'm going to just go straight into this now. So I wanted to ask what your first memorable experience was with Ricardo Knowles' work, because for me, it was when I came to the museum and I saw these pieces that were specifically like bushfires, and like I feel like most Grand Bahamians are kind of used to seeing like that particular kind of imagery because it's such a big forested kind of space, right? But there was just something really like quite visceral in my response to it. It just felt like seeing something so deeply familiar in such a particular way. And it's just, I think his perceptiveness to the environment is really interesting in that way, and it elicits a sort of bodily response. Like I instantly could smell it, you know what I mean? Like it was a proper thing. So I just wanted to know what your first experience with his work was that you can remember that felt like meaningful to you or just strong, either way. So. Whoever
We're
wants
too
to.
polite for this conversation.
I know, that's why we work with friends.
But I know exactly what works you're referencing.
Mm-hmm.
I did some research. I co-curated an exhibition with Averia Wright called From Columbus to John Canoe, and we borrowed 2 works from the Don Davies collection called Pine Barren Forest, which is the works that Natalie is referring to. They were made in 1999,
Good memory.
And I've researched.
Yeah, man, but still.
Those works, when Avery and I were thinking about the curation of the show, they truly felt like representations of the Bahamas, not just Nassau.
Right.
I'm thinking about like the pine forest in Grand Bahama and in Abaco, and how they like continuously repeat.
Right.
And Ricardo's work has a lot to do with movement and repetition, and I felt like I had too the visceral experience of feeling like these things were on fire, that they were alive. But in another sense, another one of the works that we had in the show was called Montague Dock. It's this small oil painting of a woman, full-bodied woman actually, standing in a dress with like a straw hat on at the water's edge fishing. And I
know which one you mean.
Yeah,
I know exactly which one you mean.
I remember that work stuck with me because when I first went to the National Art Gallery some time ago as a young student, it was one of those works that stuck with me as representations of women, like this like full able-bodied woman at work that had nothing to do with like traditional tropes of femininity. So she wasn't like with child or in a home, but she was outside fishing. So I thought
so
that
deeply familiar in Bahamian at the
for
same
sure,
time. Right.
For sure. So that would be mine.
I like it. I dig it. And for you?
For me, actually, it's a little different. I'm more familiar with his landscapes, so that was my first introduction. I'm definitely more familiar with the concept of stillness in his work, that nostalgic feeling that this exhibition is getting at. So that's my introduction.
I like it. I dig it. So Averia has curated this show to kind of focus on Knowles' recurring theme of like dreams and dreaminess in the work and in the landscape. And I'm particularly really drawn to the quote that she included in the exhibition text from Christian Campbell from the poem Palm. And basically it references dreams, memory, and nostalgia. So I just kind of want to think about how we might begin to discern the difference between these concepts in his work as 3 separate things. So again, dreams, memory, nostalgia. So like where do ideas of dreaming differ from memory? How does memory differ from nostalgia here? Is there any way that you can see to define these things clearly, or do they kind of mesh into one for you? Like what's significant, I guess, about these themes for you?
I think it's very hard to think of them as like three isolated things because I feel like your dreams are informed by your memories. Your memories like is inherently nostalgic. But in his work, the dreaminess comes from his hand, I believe. So the way in which he applies the oil on the surface, his liking to using like a very like pastel-y like kind of soft touch in his work. It is impressionist, you know. But the palette specifically is not just about light, because impressionism is steeped in like this rendering of light. But I think it has something to do with him pulling sort of like filtering Nassau through this like nostalgic lens that then looks dreamlike.
I like the idea of a filter with that, because that makes a lot of sense, because there's something that's very like familiar again about it, but it's also just kind of quite not that. It's like for me, it's somehow depicting our lived environment, but not necessarily the reality of what it feels like to be in it, which is kind of the interesting thing for me. It's like a sort of dissonance with that a little bit.
But then I feel like the dreaminess comes from it, because I was sitting with the work a little bit, and I was like, this is very whimsical in composition, and I think the whimsy in the composition then likens to this dreamlike state. Like, why would these little boys isolated in this corner next to, you know, Parliament be having these drums? You know, they're not quite separate occurrences that would happen, but juxtaposed to one another, it has a whimsy, and then that whimsy feels like a dream.
Makes sense. And it's also building this familiar scene with things that are also just maybe people that you don't know, but like you know the actions and you know the space. So you start to fill in things a little bit that I find interesting. So yeah, anyway, for you, dreams, memory, nostalgia, let's go.
For me, like Jodi, they mesh together for me. And for me, the memory, the dream, really comes from that isolated action or movement going on in the piece, and some works especially.
That's a good way to put it.
Like you mentioned the drummer boy, but it's really them taking up most of the movement in the canvas. Like they have the center stage. You can almost hear that sound coming from them. Yeah. And for me, that's where that memory comes in for sure.
That makes sense. I dig that.
I'm thinking too about like that that other work where there's like a man kind of like reflecting, and you can see like the carnival behind him. It's called Carnival.
Yes. No, I remember that one too.
And for me, that like isolated moment of like movement and of like that character that we can connect to really makes that kind of all blur together for me.
That makes sense. I feel like there is like a certain kind of pacing that he has in terms of like composition that's interesting, like where the focal point of movement is, and then also like there's always, for me anyway, there's always some kind of motion in the background when it comes to like the plants, particularly trees, particularly palms, which can read as like, I don't know, idealized tropical space or literally just the reality of our space, depending on like what it is, but there's something really interesting about that for me. So because Ricardo has a very strong preoccupation with the idea of dreams, the works can read sometimes as having a sense of romanticism. So is the work romantic for you, or how does it reject this classification for you?
I think it definitely is like a swooning in the work.
Swoon, yes. No, like, that's the word. Like, that's the word.
The sway of the trees, this like intention with like it just being diagonal. So I think there's something about like his hand that's very diagonal, something in the color that's very sweet as well, always. And I think it's just romantic from the approach. It seems like he has like a deep affinity to the landscape.
Intention.
Yeah. He has a deep affinity to the landscape. He also has a deep affinity to art making and painting. So I think that Ricardo is a painter's painter. Yeah. And because of the his love for painting, his love for oil, his also like love for the landscape. I think they all blend into a romantic sensibility. I don't know if it's full romanticism, but that's what I would say.
You know, I vibe with that.
Yeah, I would say that it's romantic in the sense that you're describing, but I'm going to take it there so that it is romanticism. Like I think jumping off of what you said earlier about impressionism, there's a certain like unfinished movement quality to the surface,
the blurred edges on things,
the blurred edges of things at the corners of the canvas. You can see the surface peeking out at the sides, the edges, and yes, it gives that impressionist movement, but also that sense of the sublime.
Yes.
In terms of like, wow, there's this wonderful scene, this wonderful landscape that we're looking at, that we're experiencing, and kind of we need to step back and take that in, and that makes it romantic for me.
I like it.
Yeah.
I'm also definitely going to pull out like from that comment on the sublime, because like there's also this idea that the sublime is something that's kind of awe-inspiring and a little bit unnerving. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And for me, I feel like, I'm going to dig into this a little bit more later, but there's just, again, kind of following on the sublime, I feel like there's this tension in the work that we're dealing with when it comes to depictions of our landscape and how that is rooted in all the old colonial tourist propaganda machine, and how difficult, I guess, our relationship to finding beauty in our landscape is because of that I find really interesting. So like, with that in mind, do you feel like his work is intended for a Bahamian audience or an international or visitor audience, or both? And how so?
I will say both. I say both because if he, just thinking about his biography, if he was born and raised in San Salvador, and then
Nassau,
and then migrated to Nassau, I think the nostalgia or the longing in the landscape may be for San Salvador and not necessarily Nassau.
Oh,
and
that
then,
one sent chills up my spine, because correct.
Yeah, and that's like a different kind of thinking and approach, you know. And then having like migrated from San Salvador to Nassau, then to the UK.
Right.
No, then to the US, and then
US
the UK.
And then France,
yeah.
I think, as well. Did he go to the UK
France.
as well?
Yeah. But
I can't remember.
That side of the world.
He's traveled. But basically the idea is Bahamas, America, Europe. Right. That's the trajectory.
Yeah, that's
and
the
then
trajectory.
back home.
Right. I think that
like a pilgrimage almost.
I think you can't help but to make for all of those people in all of those spaces in mind, because they then also equally inform the work in some way or fashion, I believe. So I'm thinking about being in San Salvador, looking at the landscape,
right.
Being in Nassau, having this tension, and I'm definitely projecting because I don't know if this is his sentiment, but
we're
being
just unpacking from our own experience,
right?
Too, because
being
this is
in
what we bring to our work,
looking at this city, this metropolis now, like it's a different flow. It's faster. There's a lot more movement. There's a lot more people, and then going to the U.S. and that then being a whole other experience. And then further on, but also in each place, being around artists in the U.S., being around artists in Europe, and looking at how they respond to their environments as well.
That's true.
So it's not like the fresh impressionists then went outside of France to then romanticize their landscape
Other
as well.
spaces.
So I think that all of that comes into why I believe that is both.
This makes sense. And within that, I'm also going to ask, do you feel like it's necessarily for an audience, or is this for himself?
A little of both. I think art making inherently
is though, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fair. And for you?
Of course, I agree with Jodi.
Oh yeah.
That it's both. But in terms of that, making it for himself, I also felt like there was this tension where he's reflecting on his pilgrimage, his movement between those countries, and he's kind of like, oh, I remember this, but something else is also happening in the background. I felt that in Bank Lane when there's this isolated moment of those two boys playing those drums, but also especially in Carnival, where he, of course, uses his artistic license to take away the cars, all those phone lines, the telephone
adds the
poles.
romanticism and the dreaminess, because you ain't gonna be dreaming about traffic in Nassau.
Absolutely.
Not willingly.
Absolutely.
Not willingly.
So it's almost like completely empty, which might be a gesture to San Salvador. But also there's that Ferris wheel in the background, slowly almost rising from the clouds, which also makes it dreamlike.
That's true.
So for me, I feel like he's coming to terms with all of this in this painting. So yes, I feel like someone who's not familiar with that, with that pilgrimage, but also that sense of the islands, this is different. We'll look at that painting and be like, oh wow, this is this nostalgic piece of an old time. But we as people in 2024 can look at that and be like, no, this is our modern moment. He's painting something from now, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, because also how does time kind of play into our idea of nostalgia here? What kind of time periods are being, I guess, or having nostalgia around them, I guess, in his work is something interesting, because some of them look completely like timeless. It just looks like, land before time, land after time, I don't know. But it's just like just the landscape as it is. And then there's others where obviously we have like the little boys, we have like the Ferris wheel and things that very much grounded in like a time period that we're in. But there's always something that's underlying it that feels like it's like something old and loved a little bit.
Yeah.
That's like really interesting for me, just in terms of how he's dealing with it. And again, I guess maybe that's like the whole thing with memory. Maybe some of it is sort of ancestral memory in a sense. You know what I mean? And it's like a nostalgia and longing for a time that we don't know, but maybe part of our body knows, that I think is quite interesting as well. So I guess, yes. So as the three of us have had access to living abroad and had the privilege to have that experience, and knowing that Knowles himself had that experience to cultivate his studies and his practice, I wanted to ask if you feel like there's a romanticism that we paint our space with when we aren't home, and how that might function for you, and how that might function in his work.
I think there absolutely is. I think this is a question actually Jodi asked me earlier this year on a completely different project.
That's crazy, I didn't realize. I love that alignment.
But no, I think being away from home gives you that space to kind of come to terms with that memory, that sense of the modern, that time, and your collective experience in different places, because it's always going to be different. There's going to be no place like home, but also you have to adjust to a different space. You have to figure out how to navigate all of those different styles, and as an artist, that's going to come
and your
through.
Identity in a new space. Where people maybe don't fully understand you, and you can't really necessarily translate your experience in such an easy way.
Especially as an artist, how do you make that known through the canvas? Right. How do you pay tribute to what you're learning in this new space, and how do you also display a sense of self, a sense of home that these people aren't really going to connect to? So
it's like, how do you, I guess, kind of show what you're learning and that you're engaging with a space without feeling fully assimilated into it, where you kind of have to change your voice or your aesthetic to match, I guess, what is readable easily for like other people. I feel like that's also why spaces that we have like for art spaces in the Bahamas and within the Caribbean in general are so important, because it's like we're sort of trying to navigate our own identity and our sense of self for ourselves and for like our community for the most part, even if that's not necessarily something that you're actively trying to do in your practice. Once it comes into spaces like this, I feel like that's just kind of what happens. So it's just interesting, like, again, I feel like there's also something within this where it's like, I feel like we tend to kind of malign our experience at home until we leave a little bit. We have a lot of disdain being here until we leave. And then you do get a little bit when you come back, because, some things are hard. But there's just something I think kind of in that I want to unpack as well. It's just like the difficulty, and then you go out of home and suddenly you value it in a completely different way. And I wonder how that kind of intersects like the idea of nostalgia and this sort of colonial idea of the landscape.
I was going to say, I feel like we have like an ambassador complex as...
Yes. No, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is.
As, Bahamian and Caribbean people, because we obviously have been... We've grown up with this ingrained sensibility that, we are responsible for the image of the Bahamas. Like, as singularities, the weight of the brand of tourism falls on us when we are outside of this country. So I think that just tends to show up, and you have to actively put it down and resign and be like, I'm not the ambassador of the Bahamas.
Sometimes you're just Jodi. You know what I mean?
I think the longing in the work or the romantics comes from trying to create from what you know as well. It's hard to... And I feel like maybe this is, I don't want to reach, but I wonder, do we have space to imagine possibilities that do not directly reference this locale? When you think of like dreams are rooted in, or they refer to like what we know, memory. You know what I mean? So do we have license to be imaginative outside of these memories, outside of what we know, outside of...
and is it a helpful distortion of things as well, which is interesting?
So, so I work with a lot of artists who live and work in the diaspora, who are Caribbean, and they come up against the same thing, like to and I also think it's the expectation of the world as well from us, where you know, they're like, oh, you're from the Caribbean, then why can't I see that in your work? And you're like, it's there, it's just not like palm
it's
trees.
Just that you don't speak this language.
You know,
you don't speak this visual language to understand that. You know what I mean? It's like the expectations that people have of what the tropical is. Thank you, Krista Thompson, for all the work you do. But like, basically, it's like, for me anyway, it's that expectation of you performing your tropicalness for people,
right,
rather than your reality.
And I think the beauty in when, because I'm thinking about different like artistic practices, like I'm thinking about Lavar's work, like his new work now, that directly references like a very specific point in Bahamian history, but it's romantic, but it's only romantic to us, and he's longing, and you see that there, but like it's done in a way where it's not so overt or apparent, you know. But
it feels sometimes like it's kind of trying to give like a softness in aesthetic rather than in sentiment. I think,
and I truly, just so I don't veer, but I truly just think it just the romantics or the longing or the looking back truly just comes from trying to make from what you know. Yeah,
makes sense. Yeah. Sorry. Do you want to repeat?
I just want to go off of that point when you mentioned that the softness is an aesthetic and not sentiment. I think that is something that's inherent in tropicalization. We're constantly referring to points that may not be kind, may not be pleasant to remember, but that aesthetic that is being depicted is constantly in a way that's palatable
yes, completely.
For the viewer. It's not confrontational, and I think that's something
a good way to put it. That's a very important distinction. Is like, because like you can tell when people are making literally just straight up confrontational work. Like, I mean, we're looking at John's piece over there with like him fighting himself, right? Like, it's obvious, open, sort of, but it's also dealing again with like Caribbeanness and like the landscape socially and everything that we're dealing with, but in a completely different way. That's why I'm very interested in like when people have these moments of making the landscape something beautiful, because it's undoubtedly beautiful, and we all engage with it as it is beautiful, but also there is always the thing underlying that is this tension and this history and this difficulty, and how do we engage with our environment and with our landscape, beautiful as it is, when we know that we have that as like the backstory. There's something like in that with his work that's always a little bit tense for me, even though they're beautiful, even though they're really like just easy to be around in a lot of ways. It's just, there's this little nagging thing on your shoulder that's like, by the way, trauma, that it feels like, you know? There's just something in that for me that's like really quite difficult for work that doesn't look like it's difficult to engage with. I think that kind of belies it a little bit, you know?
And I felt that especially in some of the works that are just kind of like vegetation, just a piece of, just a plant on the canvas.
That piece of casuarina that was like sun bleach. Yeah. Oh, the light on that was sweet though. Yeah. That was beautiful. I'm not gonna lie. There was something about that hit me so hard, and it just felt like, as I was going around the exhibition with Adrian, I was talking about, I was just like, there is something so like poignantly and painfully familiar about that like every time I went to the beach when I was little, because like Gold Rock Beach in Grand Bahama has like a bunch of casuarina on it, and we know how casuarina works and everything, but like the way that like it just gets bleached and silvered, and like there was such an attention to that in particular, and like the way that light works on old sun bleached casuarina, like that just did something like outstanding. And I was just like, this is literally just a broken piece of tree, but this man making me feel so much. You know what I mean? And again, that's like, I think how like the nostalgia and everything else comes kind of into it that I found really interesting. I also wanted to ask if there was any work in there that kind of gave you that sort of moment of like just a little bit of a punch of like, ooh, like that got me.
Yeah, I'm trying to recall the name of the work, but it's like an outdoor scene, but there's a fire in the front yard.
That's hard.
Yeah, and that gave me a punch because it's such like a familiar scene to me. But also, you don't expect it. Like you really don't expect people to render, you know, because it's also a tool of of discarding. You know, people light trash on fire.
Right.
In a city, that's just a fact. You know?
Right.
So, so I think for that small like moment to be like put into the work, specifically around like the kind of architecture that's in the work, it's very blue, it's very calm, but then you have like this heat of the fire in the middle of the work.
And again, that focal point, the way he paces like the actual canvas, and like the way he kind of lays that out.
Yeah, and then like thinking about impressionism and light, and the light source then being the fire as well.
That's true.
So I think that yeah, that messed me up a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know that's like deeply personal.
Yeah, and then
difficult.
also there's another one that there's like a plant, like a house plant that's like outside,
right,
in the corner of the house.
Some like aloe or sisal or something,
right?
Type thing.
Yes,
Like, yeah.
And I love, and I've always loved Cardo's work because he's such a good artist.
Right.
I think it's undeniable.
It's enjoyable.
Right. It's undeniable, the thought of the composition, and the intention of everything, and it comes from a place of like, you know that like it's skillful,
right?
And the way that he uses
but not
that,
just for the sake of it,
and not, but for the love of it.
Right.
So for the love of the craft, it's skillful and it's intentional and it's storytelling, and you know it. So when you feel, I know that he wants you to feel,
right?
You know,
right?
and I think that that's something that I miss in painting.
Yeah, because that's the thing. He takes up a very particular space, like in our sort of art community as well. I feel because like there's people who deal with landscape, but I don't know. Again, it's just that really, really like kind of doubling down on the idea of nostalgia in the landscape and trying to make it dreamy and nice for himself, even though there's difficult things tied to it. There's just something really caring about that, but there's not a lot of people who deal with the picturesque necessarily like as intentionally as he does.
Yeah,
I think that I find interesting, like, because often I think that becomes the sort of space of people whose art gets relegated to hobby. You know what I mean? Because we know how all the classes things work with that. You know what I mean? It's just if it's a popular representation of our space, then it can't have any sort of deep intellectual underpinning. They're just like, no, it's just pretty painting, and it's like, no.
No, sit with it.
Right,
you know?
exactly.
Yeah.
It's making you feel things, even if you can't like necessarily like say what it is.
For sure.
So for me, it was the horn, which was that piece that's painted on the toilet seat.
Yes, I love that. I love that one so much. I was hoping somebody was gonna bring this up. Oh, that was so good.
And I feel like that, like, yes, it's beautiful work. There's a painting on the outside of the lid, the inside of the lid, and on the seat itself, but also on the sides. And that, for me, like, just makes it kind of kitsch.
Right.
And it shows you that, like, it kind of just plays with the artificiality of what he's doing and the, like, landscape genre. Exactly. Like, oh, like, he's letting me in on this little joke that he's playing on the viewer necessarily, but also, like, an honesty.
Right. Because tourists will view that completely differently than we will.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? They'll just be like, haha, look, it's funny, you take a dump on this. And we're just like, no, you're taking a dump on the picturesque. Like, for 2 seconds. It's really kind of funny, considering he's made his, like, life's work around that.
Exactly. And not just his life's work, but also, like, this nation's life work is built on the picturesque. Hundreds and hundreds of years of effort, money, investment have gone into making
propaganda
scenes like the ones pictured on a toilet seat. And to me, that just, it's kind of a joke, but also kind of not.
Right.
Like, there's a seriousness to it that, like, really caught my attention and just, like, kind of held me, like, especially how it's kind of curated towards the end of the exhibition after
it
you're like
disrupts it in a particular way, which is very clever, Averia. So I can say
absolutely. And you kind of, it disturbs that sense of calm that you get that when you're walking through these like really beautiful scenes. Like, oh no, like there's an aspect of to this that is made, that is intentional, that might not entirely be real, but is real to me in this moment.
It felt like a Bahamian in-joke.
Yes.
Or a Caribbean in-joke. That's what it felt like in the midst of all that. Because like you can't necessarily fully tell if you don't have like the same kind of grounding and understanding of like what tropicalization is and what the picturesque is. But then there is something undoubtedly like, I see what you're doing there for everybody, regardless of if you have like those particular like words and terminology like in your brain that I find interesting. So how does Cardo's work fit into the wider Bahamian and Caribbean art canon for you? Does it function in terms of landscape? Like, how does it function in terms of landscape painting? And what does it do in relation to other portrayals of landscape and people in particular? Because like there's also a little bit of a difference in how he treats actual like portraits, I think, of people versus landscape in his work. That's kind of interesting. So if you could just unpack any of that.
Yeah, when I saw this question, I thought of Dr. James's Bahamian modernism essay when she said that there's neorealism and neo-impressionism that's steeped into our Bahamian art history canon. And of course, when you think about those people, it's the Eddie Minnises and the Chan Pratts and so on.
And celebrating skillful painting, really.
For sure.
Because that's, I think, part of like where we find like a lot of our sort of pride. I think a lot of people, you start to realize you're good at art because you're good at dealing with realism.
Yes.
And then you kind of branch out usually after that, or you double down on it like
For
real
sure.
hard.
Yeah. And so they would have been in the 60s, 70s onward. But then in Jamaica, because I'm just like trying to center around like neo-impressionism, Jamaica also had a wave of it.
Oh, absolutely.
In the 50s and the 60s. And when
the decolonization around the Anglo-Caribbean happening at that time
right.
as well.
But also this is then like having in spaces like Puerto Rico and Jamaica, like impressionism like happening as well, you know what I mean?
And also interesting example because again, colonial nation and non-colonial nation or emancipated nation.
Yeah, and I think Cuba as well, but I'm not too sure about that. But when you think of these Caribbean spaces, specifically those who were colonized by the French and you know the Spanish, like they have like longer art historical roots than us, purely by people like going and the Dutch.
Oh yeah.
Yes, purely by people you know like traveling there, making work there, representing, rendering the space.
Quote unquote expat artists.
For sure.
Back in the day.
Yeah, but then you have like this now emancipated class of people in this like quest of independence and nationhood. When you think about like the Caribbean between the 1930s and the 1970s, now looking back onto their spaces, rendering their spaces, and Cardo is like at the end of that, so he's coming later than Minnis, and because he's coming later than Minnis, he's not just representing the landscape as is. So when you look at Eddie Minnis's work, the abstraction in his work comes from the way that he paints with the palette knife. So these like and the color then like vibrates off of the canvas because of that. Chan Pratt is very focused on the architecture, like really grounding the scene in where it is. I believe that he also painted from observation. Eddie painted from observation, but now that you have...
and Cardo did too, and that's how he got his first commission, I believe, as well.
Yeah, so now you have Cardo starting in that same vein, but like now branching off... I think that's where you have the subversion in his work, and the kind of like
in between spaces,
right?
In a way, like a liminal sort of space between movements.
Yeah, and the cheek, and I think that the cheekiness and the intention of the composition, I think, is more apparent in his work than you would see in like Eddie Minnis painting. You know what I mean? I think
correct. Definitely.
Yeah, and then the rendering of people as well. So. In Minnis's work, there's a lot of attention on the architecture because he was an architect.
Exactly.
You know, and like the like town planning and whatever, but the people were also the landscape, and not in the context of now, because you have to think of this being like revolutionary of painting, you know, Black Bahamians in these scenes when he was making this work. But now that you have Cardo, a little later on, the people are active participants. They are the focal point. They like, why is this police officer next to, you know, this beach, or you know, like there's a lone officer mean? Right,
what does that do to us
in this like serenity? So yeah, that's how he fits in the art historical of it all, I believe.
Nope, brilliant answer, beautiful.
For me, as an art historian, I look way back. So my specialty is in transatlantic slavery studies. So for me, it brought up a lot of the writings of Katie Ann Chris, Charmaine Nelson, and they look at the colonial drawings of like New Nassau, New Jamaica, and they situate that within the picturesque. So for me, it brought back particularly some of the urban drawings of Joseph Kidd from the early 19th century. And he is depicting the British colonies as urban, but also controlled.
Right, because that's key to the picturesque and the tropical, right? Like the re-imaging of the West Indies as this idyll and like Eden.
Yeah.
Completely, makes sense.
Exactly. And after sugar, after cotton, after the plantation failure, and they realized that they had to move to something else, they were like, oh, we're going to show these spaces as new and habitable for potential colonists. That, for me, can be applied to this work because of the urban spaces that we see that are ordered, that are neat, where everyone looks like they have a place,
right?
Or that they're like kind of naturalized into the landscape. It's not, but at the same time, he's pushing back against that with the modern, with that like insistence that this is now. There's a fault in those 19th century images where the people depicted seem isolated. They seem
Like so.
They seem alone. Exactly,
Right.
like this.
Posed, staged.
So
right.
that's 1920. The images I'm thinking about are 1830, but it's the same type of image.
Right.
It's so that broader like visual culture is what I'm thinking about when I come to these paintings, and how the artist is coming to terms with that modernism and this long colonial past that we're breaking away from.
That was so nice.
I like it.
Yeah, because keep going. Yeah, because thank you, Simone. Because I'm also thinking about like those photographs from that time as well, where people are like very stoic and stylized, and especially like formerly enslaved people photographed at work or staged like at work. So there was like this like
in labor,
like there was this like wave of documentation of labor to say that this is what's going on in the colonies, and then it like switched to this is the colony, this is the landscape, and the same kind of order. Yeah, that was really beautiful. Thank you.
And exactly, when you mention labor, the labor is different in these urban settings. So like the labor in those like 1830s paintings would have been like the person walking by like pushing a cart, but the labor that we see, that we can consider in Cardo's work is like those boys beating a drum. Like that's a different type of labor. That's
it's also
performed.
like labor being tied to landscape to now labor being tied to urban spaces in a different way. That's really interesting as well.
And cultural identity. Like,
Absolutely.
Like that's a type of work in itself, to project that like knowledge of culture, of history, of self.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I love y'all. Anyways. So I guess my next question is, how do we engage with the picturesque in urban Bahamian settings, as the exhibition title and imagery suggest, when the picturesque is so often tied to the natural landscape instead of the urban, often? So how does his work fit into this? How does it reject it, if at all? There's something, anyway, just at the root of this is just like, it's very interesting how he's dealing with urban landscapes and how that's tied to the social in a way that I feel like the natural landscape is much more sort of isolated, and it's supposed to be about this untouched, Edenic kind of space. But now there's this very intentional addition of basically the role of people in the landscape, as opposed to as just being this beautiful, unspoiled, untouched space that the tourism propaganda machine loves. You know what I mean? There's something about how we deal with the picturesque when it's an urban space, when urban spaces are not necessarily always viewed as beautiful. In part because I think of the way that people don't necessarily feel comfortable about Black-dominated spaces when it comes to tourism sort of, imagery and aesthetic and what's being pushed.
For me, that just comes back to order and social order, and that idea of comfort being expressed through that, or being or being encouraged through that. So you have these streets that are dreamlike. You have these spaces that are still beautiful, but when someone is in them, they're naturalized into the landscape. They take up the same type of movement as the vegetation.
Literally blending in a certain sense.
Being depicted in the urban space. And they, and that order, that movement with the landscape, I think fits in really well with what has the foundations that have already been laid down in terms of naturalization, in terms of those really scenic seascapes, landscapes, stretches of forest. Yeah.
Makes sense. I dig it.
My brain's like going a mile a minute.
I know, there's a lot in this. There's a lot.
Ask me the question again.
All right. So,
Please.
how does Carter's work fit into, no, not that one, it's this one. How do we engage with the picturesque in urban Bahamian settings when the picturesque is often so tied to the natural landscape? How does this work fit into this? How does it reject it, if at all?
I think the question that my brain asked myself was, have we created a new ideal? Because if the...
That's interesting.
Yeah, because if the pinnacle of Bahamian architectural production is how, we inherited from the Carolinas this boat building aesthetic that went into like the building of these like offices and not offices, they're offices now, but like Parliament and other like historic buildings like that, then we see as like the pinnacle of our architectural production, and we kind of we romanticize that, and that is picturesque because we stop to name this as historic and beautiful, but have we then like moved on to recognize the cultural production or the urban development, the kind of landscape production of what is, to then like ground it to say that this then is like another, or this is, I hope y'all following me, but like this is the other like pinnacle of Bahamian like artistic expression that then revolves in how we exist. Like
it feels like performative in a sense.
It is performative, but it's also like the landscape, like the way that so I'm thinking about my grandmother's house, right? There's a painting in the show which like you see the house in the distance, so it almost looks like a backyard scene with this like lush bush in motion. It almost looks like it's raining, but at the same time that looks like my grandmother's house, so I have an affinity to the picturesque in that way. It doesn't feel distant from me because this exists in the now, like Simone is saying. But then my grandmother's house and the way that she landscapes is not thought of as Bahamian landscaping, right?
She just is doing her yard.
She just planted things, and I feel like because we're not having conversations and we're not naming things, we're not looking at things, we're not like adopting new ideas or even looking at what we're doing in a way that encapsulates it into like this modernity or this contemporary sense. Like, what is the Bahamian contemporary aesthetic? What is the Bahamian modern aesthetic? And not necessarily because we know what the Bahamian colonial aesthetic is,
right? Painfully intimately,
so it's easy to look at the picturesque and go to the colonial when
because they're one and the same, really, to be fair.
But what I'm saying is in addition to the neo-colonial of it all exists in this modern reality or in this contemporary reality.
Which feels like an awareness is added onto it, so now it's a slightly different thing.
Right. So we exist in this like hybridity where those spaces, those colonial spaces still stand. This colonial like thinking of landscaping and the development of areas still stand, but then there's still a whole other way in which, my mom, who's an architect, goes about making plans. There's a whole way in which concrete revolutionized like how our buildings are, and so I don't know if that answers the question.
Oh no, you're good.
But I think that's what that has me to think about, because I'm often when I think about the picturesque, the spaces that I come into feeling that like they're so beautiful or are nostalgic for me are spaces that were just made in the 80s and the 90s, because I'm a young one, but I don't, because I just that is for me, like it's nostalgic to see like gargoyles on posts on these like concrete walls, or like the I think they're called wind but the Caribbean like concrete blocks that allows wind to come through. The breeze blocks, like those kinds of like things are nostalgic for me, but I just don't think that we've spent enough time documenting, naming, and allowing ourselves to be proud of that, and also to come to it with and to come to it with kind of reverence that situates it as picturesque as well. Or
makes sense.
Anyway, I'm rambling at this point.
No, man, you good. I also just feel like it's just interesting, like in terms of dealing with like the urban landscape, when like part of the way that NASA was sort of pushed forward for tourism back in the day was the fact that it wasn't as developed and the landscape wasn't quite as scarred essentially by sugar plantation like places like Barbados. And now when you're in Nassau, obviously, it's just like there's development happening all the time. So it's like it's not fitting into this original idea, but we keep pushing that in the tourism propaganda, right? Like even today, because it's always just like, look how big and open this beach is. And it's like, that's not in Nassau.
That is Exuma.
Exactly.
Yes.
And Grand Bahama and Abaco and
Yes.
everywhere else. It's just like, it's just interesting for me, like how that kind of feels like it doesn't quite fit a little bit that I like. It's a little uncomfy in a good way. So I also want to ask, how do you feel about the sort of French impressionist aesthetics in his work? So for me, it kind of gives like a deference to the natural environment and a calmness and a sense of wonder. But again, how can we give this same sort of dreaminess without connections to global powers or the European art canon? You know what I mean? Because we often use that to justify or validate the work that comes out of our spaces. And I think sometimes like the journeys that we make to go elsewhere to learn and to study are partly because of that insecurity maybe that we have a little bit. So if you could just kind of, I guess, yeah, speak to that a little bit. How does the European influence sit with you in this work?
Since I'm the non-art historian
Oh,
on this
girl, I'm not
panel,
either. I trained as an artist. We're good. You're good.
I had to like go back and like refresh on what impressionism actually is, and I'm actually glad that I did that because I think with any, I think the problem is imbalance, right? So there's a lot of sensibilities in the way that we approach image making, composition making, art making that are inherently like African.
There's so many like Junkanoo aesthetic works around here, right?
Right.
Like just
And,
as an example.
So when you think about like color theory and like this like, and I think color theory is one of the like more apparent like sensibilities from Junkanoo that you could pull to like look at in Cardo's work. I wouldn't put that on French Impressionism. When I think about like the variety of color in the work, it's because the variety of color is in the landscape.
It's taking the authority back here a little bit, which is nice.
Yeah, and then the Caribbean light just is the Caribbean light.
Facts.
So I think if you're rendering that through just an approach, and I think one of the things that I had to consider was that these genres were just new ways of seeing to then. Yes. So
lens.
it was just a lens because your Impressionism came about around the same time that photography was getting popular. So they were just trying to offer a new way of painting or a new approach to painting that countered what photography was doing or what it couldn't do. And I think it's beautiful when you think about our photographic history here that Cardo's in the same thing. So it's just like extracting the principle of Impressionism rather than. And I think that's what all kind of like global art genres do. They extract the principle.
What's useful to you in your space.
Right.
Translate it somehow.
And you then like put the principle into your context. And I think that that's what his work does very beautifully.
I love that. Absolutely.
For me, the French Impressionist aesthetics added a layer of suspicion.
Yes.
So,
the tension.
So, I'm thinking about how when the French Impressionists came out with the style, like everyone hated it. Like Jodi's mentioning the history of photography, but like it just wasn't considered fine art. It was considered like unfinished scribbles, and so here we see this like sense of movement, this like beautiful color palette, this beautiful brushwork that we're able to appreciate now. But for me, it also like just made me go, like, why this choice? Like, yes, like a perfect landscape could have been on that on those canvases. Like a crystal clear image
Super
could have
realist.
been there. Super realist, hyper realist could have been there.
Nice sharp edges on things and
But it's not. It's a deliberate choice to show the brushstrokes, to show where the colors mix, where they don't mix, to create those distinguishing characteristics in this work. So it made me question that. But it also going back to the history, it made me question what purpose Impressionism has in these scenes. So when we look at the modern Impressionist, the modern French Impressionists at the time of photography, they came out with that license that they had the ability to depict modern life on the surface of the canvas in a way that photography could not capture, which gave their work legitimacy. So I
That's
wonder,
very interesting in the context of his work with
Right?
all the old colonial photographs with like the scenes that he has now. It's just that's
Yeah.
a really, really interesting comparison.
so what is being made legitimate here that isn't
That's a good word for it.
legitimate in those colonial photographs, in a perfect copy, in a perfect landscape, in the most ideal landscape possible? What is he able to show that still captures Bahamian modern life that other mediums, other scenes can't? So
There's
that's
something
where
in
it
his
took me.
gaze maybe as well. I think that's what it is as well. It's like the way that old colonial tourist visitors would have viewed the landscape and how they're literally viewing it through their lens in that way, and how he is taking these sort of moments of like essentially like rebellion a little bit, even though Impressionism is very much like kind of a very loved and accepted part of like, you know, art aesthetics now. It's just like you were saying, it wasn't. So it's just interesting that he's taking this thing that again is also kind of wrapped up in things that seem nice and things that seem pretty, but have like a history that maybe is not quite so much that. Is interesting in a way that I wasn't actually thinking about before. So thank you, both of y'all. So I wanted to ask as well, who do you think deals with landscape in a way that is in conversation with Cardo's work, but maybe perhaps more by like opposition or difference in their work? So for me, this could be like Bahamian artists from the wider Caribbean, but the first sort of people that come to mind for me is Tessa Whitehead's work, because she deals with darkness in the landscape, and Ricardo's work is very much about light. And also similarly, John Dunkley from Jamaica, who's also got very like dark sort of, they look like these mystical, magical, deep forest kind of paintings. There's just something about maybe, I don't know, whose work is he in conversation with in a way where it's like, this is perhaps directly opposite to this? I don't know. Or, you know, it could be similar as well. Whatever comes to mind. Who is he in conversation with?
My initial thought, I know, was Heino. Just because Heino consistently references the landscape by living it out.
Those horizon works?
Yeah.
With the like pieces of wood?
So I'm thinking about the horizon line. I'm thinking about just his use of materials and how he's not afraid to like pull the dried palm.
Literal environment.
Right,
Like,
pull into the work. And it's so sculptural, and I think that the way that Heino approaches the landscape in such a subversive, also like it's not important, like, but it's so important because this is like rooted directly in
Exactly.
like, he will tell
it couldn't
you
happen without this place existing, right?
right. And then when you think about like Chippenham, you know, like Chippenham is so integral to his practice. I think I would love to kind of like sit with that and maybe write an essay about that, because I think that'd be cool.
Please
But I also think Kendra as well. Like when I think about Kendra's practice is about the preservation of culture and the preservation of, you know, these colonial buildings and colonial aesthetics. These like little knobs here, little doorposts and stuff like that here. Between Tampa and the Bahamas. So when you're thinking about someone who's like working between two spaces, working with the aesthetics between two spaces, there's something about like rust and like decay in her work. That
also that as an experience in itself is just so deeply Caribbean, because we be moving, we're nomadic in a sense, you know. Yeah,
and I think that also is like reflective in Cardo's work. Like it's implied that there is a decay here. There's implied that there's a long like history, like these things just like settle into place. And I thought about Kendra's work, like the way that she builds and constructs, and also the ways that he like references like this like building and construction.
Makes sense. In a weird way, Kendra's work almost like it preserves like the old historical in a way that you kind of, the contemporary aesthetic belies that, so you don't necessarily read it that way, because I was not thinking about her work necessarily in that particular kind of like terms until just now, and I was just like, oh, you're right though. Like that's real. Yeah. Right. And for you, Simone, whose work is he in conversation with? You could. Man, you could.
Well, I just wanted to say that I was so excited for this question.
Yes.
Both of you are such experienced curators. I was so excited.
I'm glad.
But for me, my bias is in works that I've been looking at really recently.
Yeah.
So I was looking at Ricardo Barnett's work, and some of his landscapes
Barrett? From museum?
From museum.
Okay, yeah, Barrett.
I'm saying it wrong.
You
I'm
good,
sorry.
you good, man. You good. Don't
But
stress.
his work, because his work from the 2010s, in some of the, he captures that dreamlike aspect that is also going on here, but in a complete disruption of the landscape. So there's I was looking at one where from his series where he's creating like almost a portal in the work, and the figures are intersecting with the landscape in ways that are almost cartoonish, that are larger than life, completely distorting the scale.
The use of cartoons in his work, given how we deal with the landscape and with tourist propaganda, is really, really interesting. I didn't think about that before.
Which is still like the oppositional, like isolated figures, kind of like separate from the architecture going on in the work or the infrastructure. But to me, it just like took a different twist to what is going on here. Also, we're sitting right across from it. Your Country Name Too, by Averia.
Brilliant example, yeah.
So completely in opposition to what's going on in Ricardo's work. So we get the modern Bahamian landscape, but we get a complete rejection
of the tourist.
Of the tourist, of the picturesque. Well, not even so much the picturesque, but the Bahamian's place in the picturesque.
Right, correct. That part specifically, that delineation.
And we move in that work in a completely different space than what is going on in urban light. So that for me as well, I love that. Is really different. Yeah.
I have so much to say. I'm sorry.
Let's go. No, please keep going.
Unlock something, but I'm also thinking about Tamika's work, Tamika Galanis's work, especially the work that she did for the Double Dutch with Riddell. Also, then have to bring Riddell Warner into this space as well, because I think that there's something that. I don't know why I keep going back to the architecture and the work, but also like the history and the land of the work that Ricardo's making as well. And I think that artists who work in a more like Afro-surrealism like sensibility have to be in conversation with this, because the land, I think Lavon just said it, and they're fresh in my brain because we just had that show.
It was a great show.
She was talking about how like the land is also a co-conspirator in our rebellion, and I think
oh, I love that. She had some good lines, dog.
She did. I also like I would also like assert like, what if the land in Ricardo's paintings are also like conspirers in this, like to subvert the colonial gaze, you know,
just letting
like
it speak in a different voice,
because they too have been transplanted, you know, the palm trees have been transplanted. All of this greenery is also not well, most of it is not indigenous here, so they too have to be in rebellion for the purpose rebellion of the purpose that they were brought here to serve. So maybe that's where the overgrowth comes from. Maybe that's where the, you know, the vines that go up into the trees that like come through the floors of these like old decaying spaces as well. I think that there's something more to the picturesque, as like a, maybe the picturesque is the rebellion, you know, in some sense.
Oh, that comes full circle.
Some sensibilities.
I like it. I hadn't thought about it that way.
Good.
That's really interesting. Like we're weaponizing it against itself in a weird way. Ooh, I love that. I love y'all, Dread. All right. Let me see. I'm going to go to the last couple questions, just because we got like 8 minutes. I know. We done good, guys. Thanks for being here. Okay, so let's see. Outside of the critical lens of how romanticized or idealized Caribbean landscapes play into the problematics of how we are seen, how we were seen, and how tourism functions, this sort of liminal space between the dream and reality of his works, I feel like they help us view ourselves in our space in a way that maybe can be more hopeful, as dreams can be. So for you, and this is kind of thinking towards the future a little bit, how does urban light help us to see and value ourselves differently and encourage dreaming for you? Or how might these works help us to take up space to dream for ourselves on our own terms and imagine futures that can hold us?
I think we have to come to a place where we are okay with our present hybridity.
Accepting all the sides of everything.
Yeah.
That's hard.
It's
It
hard.
makes sense, though. It makes sense.
Because the tension is, the history
Trust me, girl,
is.
I know it intimately.
The difficulty is like these things are, and either and we could do the work to undo, and I think we've done a lot of work to undo, and we will continue to do a lot of work to undo. But there's something in acceptance that helps us to like strip down on what we actually need to undo and what we actually need to keep on doing.
True.
And I think Cardo's work creates like a beautiful site where it's okay if the parliament buildings are nice.
I know.
It's okay to like that.
I know.
Pink and green together with the white trim because it just works.
It's so hard to like let yourself love it. It's such a weird space to be in.
But then I think,
like you're saying, it's part of our reality. So like rejecting it completely is also kind of partly rejecting your reality a little bit.
But I
you
also
gotta accept it to assimilate and to change it, I think.
Right, but I also think that there's also a whole other like side of Bahamianness or like Nasuvians who work so subversively, who love the pomp and pageantry. Like they're
with an
like
awareness.
Pardon?
But with an awareness.
With an awareness, like they're like, we're not here for the monarchy outside of the fact that they allow us to dress up. Like, like we're not here for the fabrication of all of these things, but like this thing gives me prestige, and I think that it's something about learning from that.
Yeah.
In the way that we are able to hide things in things for ourselves. The
Is
way
it like
that
a trying on of things and taking it off and trying something else on and taking it off kind of thing, maybe in a certain sense?
And then I think it then gives us space to allow the hybrid to evolve in the conditions that we want it to evolve in.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Because I'm also thinking about like ecosystems, right? Like if all of our roots have been like intertwined to this point, if all of if we've learned to be dependent, if we've learned
big
to
root ball,
pardon?
Like a big root ball,
a big
just
root
like
ball.
tangled.
Yeah,
you can't unravel that.
Right. If we've learned to do that, if we've learned to evolve and adapt, and we don't give ourselves credit for the ways that we have evolved and adapted into this like new like evolutionary hybrid space. Do you really want to go to do the DNA work of changing the DNA? And I think that, and this is all philosophical, like all philosophical. Please dismantle all the systems.
Because the philosophical and the systems them show up in a real life.
Yeah,
so
but
like, that's what we got. That's where we is.
Yeah, but I think that there's something beautiful in his work that allows us to just like exhale. Like there's a lot.
It does feel like that.
Yeah,
like a sigh, like a psychological sigh.
Like there's a lot of beauty in it. There's a lot, and I think, and not beauty from like kind of shallowness, but there's a depth to that beauty that is not distant from me, and it's not distant from us, and it's not distant from the fact that these things have influenced me. It's not like
it's rooted in love and care, which is why it feels less strange perhaps than a tourism commercial that literally just shows you your beach that looks beautiful and it looks beautiful,
right? Because it's there's honesty to his whimsy, there's honesty to the juxtapositions, there's honesty to the things that are out of place, to the dreams, and I think you do need moments where where you could just exhale and just allow things to be and allow things to be comfortable, and then you move away to then continue to undo and do.
I feel that. I like that. And for you, Simone?
So it was interesting that Jodi brought up the concept of hybridity, because for me, I feel like that gets at the sense what I was thinking about, but I was thinking more about like the shifting positions of viewership. So for me, the works really caused me to question what is shared, what's ours, what is ours. And that dreaming to me is encouraged through those shifting positions. And I feel like you get that in the work. As you move through the exhibition, you're allowed to like kind of have those different points of gaze. And I think that's encouraging.
Yeah, holding simultaneous views at once, because that sort of disjointedness is just inherently so Caribbean. The double conscious all the time, and it's just, I think maybe sometimes we don't necessarily think of picturesque work in that way, because often it's just supposed to be read as landscape, pretty, isn't it? Okay, tourism, you know what I mean? And it's just like there's so much more than that going on.
Yeah, there's not this single view. Like there's hybridity, there's multiplicity, there's like all of these opportunities for a different perspective.
I love it. I think I'm going to end there. I really think that was good. I love y'all. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining too. So, yes. So now we will also open up to questions from the audience, if you have any. And Jordan's got the mic over there, so please speak directly into the mic so they can record it, so that it can be in the archive and be useful for people. Because if we can't hear you, then people in the future can't, and that's going to be a problem. Thank you. Go on. It'll be a good one.
Good evening, and thank you for your wonderful contributions. So I wanted to pose a question based on a comment that Jodi had made about what she recognizes a lack of critical, we can call it naming or classifications of contemporary Bahamian aesthetic production. I wanted to know how you might account for this lack or this dearth, and whether that might have to do with anything around a culture of anti-intellectualism, maybe a stunted intelligentsia. Is it because of this era of polycrisis and people just worrying about how to survive? What do you think is stopping the kind of emergence and then the naming of new Bahamian cultural movements? That would be my question. It's based on what Jodi said, but anybody is welcome to chime in.
I think it's a product of all of the things that you mentioned and us just being too close to it. I think that, for example, we don't have a lot of like written books on like Junkanoo. Like there's not a lot of documentation on how to build a Junkanoo costume that you could just like buy, a book out of Book World about it, because the people who actually have that knowledge are in the shack doing it.
Because it's tacit knowledge, it's felt, it's palpable.
Yeah, and then so whenever like progressions and evolutions happen and changes in costume making happens, the people who actually have witnessed to it are also, the dancers or whatever. So I think it's us not. I don't think it's like anti-intellectualism. I just think that, one, we're quite a secretive people because we've had a lot of things taken from us.
Yeah, there's a distrust.
Yeah,
it is difficult, especially I think when it comes to like people taking up space, like, and being like visible themselves as well.
Right.
Because that makes you open to criticism in a certain way that's difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that it's difficult to then, like, for example, if the art historian comes in, how do you trust the art historian not to say that she is the expert on this thing because she learned from you?
Because who has authority in the conversation and the narrative here?
Exactly. Right? And I think that, and I also think that we maybe just have to realize that we could just write our own histories. Like we can't wait for the kind of the way that the U.S. does it, or institutions do it. We have to be people that write the things that we've done. Like if you did a really cool thing, document it. Write a book.
Share it.
It's self-publish. And write your own story, because then from your self-authorship, other people are gonna come in and contextualize that. So I think we just need to be incentivized and encouraged to have self-authorship.
I love that. It's like validating yourself for yourself instead of waiting for somebody to say, yes, you are this thing.
Yeah.
I feel like there's also like just a practical sort of thing of, we didn't have as many folks going off to study art history because of all the barriers to access that are involved in that. And I feel like now we're kind of getting a little bit more of that happening. So I feel like it's coming. I feel like it's loading. I just feel like it's not there yet. Does that make sense? I feel like people are kind of adjusting to this moment that we're in, trying to figure it out. But let the actual art historian who's come back, let me know.
So when you asked your question, Ethan, it made me think, and Jodi, in your response as well, the movements I feel like that were earlier, even than this cultural moment, haven't been named, haven't been chronicled in the way that they need to be. So I feel like there's also this like space that we're holding for even just that looking back at work that's already been made and is waiting for someone to write about it. So we also have that like backlog of like
that's a good way to put it.
intellectual like space that needs to be taken up. So there's so much in front,
Right.
There's so much in back. How do we move forward?
Where the hell do you go?
Yeah.
How do you plan like a path through any of this? No, that's a lot. It makes sense. A little overwhelming. I like it though.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Great. Anybody else have questions?
Sorry, just before we move on, those of you in the audience who, have been caught the bug to like write, that's your charge to write.
Please.
Okay.
Please, Jesus.
That's it.
Thank you. We need it.
Hello. So my question is kind of for any of you guys, but I was thinking about how much earlier you all talked about being away from home and how that has kind of impacted how you view home now. So I guess my question is along the lines of what is the fine line of, I guess, feeling that his work definitely covers areas where we feel nostalgic and embracing our present, but also kind of that dreamy like quality that he captures, especially with the fact that there's no, I guess, sense of the modern era of like consumerism and capitalization that we feel a lot, and that, I guess, sense of slowness and simpleness and like stability almost in his work. So I guess to me it's like, do you see the fine line of trying to embrace the present of where we are now, but also almost yearning for the time that we were in, I guess, a slower, stable nation?
One of my very good friends, Matthew David Ramming, said in all Bahamian artwork, there's always two truths and a lie.
Oh, Matthew has come out with the good ones.
And I think
like
that the truth is the truth is his gaze. The truth is that, all of the things that are present here are present, and then the lie is the time frame or the period in which it actually sits in. The lie is in the and it's not a lie from the like a falsehood, but a lie in that
An embellishment, perhaps.
right is in his artistic license. So that's what I would say.
I love that.
I think the line that you are that you're mentioning is present. I think it's present in a lot of the works, and I feel like it goes back to those multiple perspectives. So I feel like, for example, I'm thinking about the horn in your question. There's that beautiful surface, but there's also the material itself that is speaking its own language to the viewer. So there's this repurposing, there's this sense of this work has gone, this object was used in a different way, and now it has this whole different meaning as an art piece. So I feel like that is one way to interpret that line. I think it's present in other works that we've mentioned earlier as well. But yeah.
I feel like there's also like this sort of divide with time where it's like urban is modern and then the natural landscape is timeless. That kind of gets things like a little bit mixed up where it's like urban, modern, rural, timeless thing. And I think that kind of complicates stuff a little bit. Again, with like his trajectory himself as an artist, like Sansal, Nassau, US, France, back. You know what I mean? Like that has to do something with your sense of time and place in a particular way that I think is interesting too. So yeah, thank you for that question. Anybody else? I think we have, we got time.
Sorry, Ryan. Just wanted to add to that response a little bit. I think that, like Jodi said earlier, that Ricardo is a painter's painter, and with that comes a great level of skill. I heard somebody say at one of his exhibitions, he could do this in like 15 minutes, right? And what's interesting to me in that thought process is that the level of skill he has is very much tied to finding that line and understanding your composition, understanding your medium, and a great deal of that comes from practice. And you could go and ask an electrician to come fix something in your house, and he'll charge you whatever he charges you for that. and he finishes it in 15 minutes, and you're like, and I have to pay you all of this. A part of art is, of course, understanding your skill level, understanding your medium, understanding how you work with your tools. And so I feel like Ricardo is definitely, you know, in his over 50 years practice, has gotten to that point where he can do that in his 15 minutes and be admired for his abilities in that level. But apart from skill, is, like you guys said, lived experience. So I think a few of us have had experiences where we have been outside of Bahamas and be able to observe it from a different perspective. And that is a big deal, a part of it as well. So I just wanted to add those 2 points.
I'm very about it, because it's like you were saying, it's like it's not just 15 minutes, it's 15 minutes plus 50 years.
Right.
Like that's
exactly.
the thing that people forget. It's like you might see that moment, but there is practice, and that's why we call it an art practice, right? So I love that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an observation, but to your point, Natalie, that you made earlier about the work, like Tessa's work being in conversation with Ricardo's work. And so it made me really think about looking at these pictures at the paintings, because at one moment they look very vibrant, but if you really look at them carefully, then they almost look brooding in a way, because the shadows are very shadowy,
moody.
Yeah, they look very moody. So at first glance, they capture the eye because it's like, you know, it's very colorful and it's vibrant, and the pinks are pink. But when you look at them, you study them a little bit closer, it is like this kind of like shadowy, like undertone that I think, to your point with the two truths and a lie, like maybe that's the lie, like the truth or vice versa.
I feel it.
But like it looks vibrant and Caribbean and sunny and that, but like the undertone is maybe like one of the truths.
I feel like there's also something about the fact that like his work would be very like bright and vibrant elsewhere, like where they might have more muted palettes and things. But for us, like our gauge for brightness and vibrance is Junkanoo. You know what I mean? So this is muted by those terms, which is kind of interesting. But like again, in a different setting, in a different space, it's definitely it's much more kind of vibrant over there. It's strange. Like it fits different spaces in different places and different times.
And then back to the question, I know a lot of artists, like when they, you know, make work about home, they tend to go straight for the color.
Right.
Like they're like, they go for the neons, the oranges, the pinks, the reds, because they're trying.
And if you don't, it's in like opposition to that purposefully.
Yes.
Right. It's always about that though.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. About it. Thank you, Rayanne. Do you have anything? You good? Okay. Anybody else?
Jodi, so when I heard you mention the pomp and pageantry, and you also mentioned the 2 truths and 1 lie to Bahamian art, it kind of suggested to me a kind of selectiveness that not just Nasuvians but Bahamians in general take toward how they experience Bahamian culture. So using that artistic license, how do you think that might impact art history going forward for Bahamians?
That's a good question. I think of Bahamian culture and how we experience different levels of Bahamian culture from a class perspective. I think what you define as Bahamian culture is directly influenced by what class you grew up in. And when you have art historians who are coming up from different like class backgrounds, that then informs their curiosities in some way. And it also tends to inform their gaze, like anybody, you know, their gaze and their curiosities. So I know for example, Ricardo Knowles, who may not, she doesn't define as an art historian, but she's doing quite art historical work because she wasn't able to use Bahamian Creole English throughout her upbringing. Her curiosity and her research is about that and about how to implement that into the wider like context. And then with you know Simone who is right here Simone, Simone's curiosity lies in straw work because that is, directly tied to Simone's upbringing. Her grandmother, I think about Krista Thompson, who was once an artist, and she dabbled into photography for a little bit, and then she did a whole her research.
There's always a pipeline, dog.
It's
always.
It's just and I think so I think Bahamian culture, with Bahamian culture, how we live, how we dress, how we eat, what we experience, and how all of that then comes back into the next influences directly what you're going to be curious about. Mm-hmm. That curiosity is going to lead you to research. That research is going to lead you to publishing works, and I think that's how we will then have more documentation.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Anybody else any questions? Also, thank you for that question. Hey, Dino.
Hello, I'm thoroughly enjoying this talk, by the way. Okay.
Thank you.
But my question, well, first, I've noticed that you use the word honesty multiple times when in regards to Carlo's work. Mm-hmm. I think my question is just for a little bit of understanding. How can an artist become honest within their practice? And I think there was also mentioned, artists using popular contexts, compositions, say maybe right now the new thing is, say, a police officer. Right. I've seen that multiple times in the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. How can an artist, outside of the popularity of using this object, find the honesty in themselves as to why they're using it?
I feel like there's something that kind of comes from removing something from being an icon in your landscape to being something personal. And I think that's where the sort of, we say honesty, but also authenticity kind of comes through, I think. Because there's, at least for me, I feel like there's a lot of performativity that we have when it comes to Bahamian culture in terms of I feel like sometimes we act it so that we can figure out what it is for ourselves, if that makes sense, which I think just comes from having a culture that's been dictated to you generally by colonial powers or tourism and things like that. You have to kind of participate to then try on things, see what fits, what doesn't work, what does work, and kind of unpack it that way. But it feels clumsy and difficult, I think. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily want to talk about their work in that way or show that part of their process because we always hide all of our sketches and stuff, right? But I think there's, I don't know, I feel like there's something in that, if that helps answer towards your question. But I'm gonna let these ladies go.
So a part of that honesty and that performativity that you mentioned, Natalie, I feel like a big part about breaking from that is vulnerability.
Facts.
I know when I was trained as an artist in landscape painting, at those FinCo workshops, it was more about it was more about.
Hey, Ricardo Knowles is also a FinCo workshop
absolutely
person. Just saying.
At those FinCo workshops, it was about the surface of the paint. It was about getting a beautiful picture. Mm-hmm. But I feel like honest work that takes you to a different place is about risk, is about kind of exposing that part of yourself. And you can feel it when you look at a work and you feel it touch you in a way that's really significant. And for me, a lot of the work that I like to look at really hinges on that vulnerability.
That makes a lot of sense. I love that.
I think I have such a different answer.
That's good. We need different options for people.
Yeah,
representation. Let's go.
I think I was gonna say, I think you have to being an artist. I want to start this from the perspective of being an artist is inherently vulnerable, and then you have to decide what you want to be honest about and what you don't want to be honest about, understanding that this is just a capitalistic engagement, if you're being 100.
I know. That's the bounds that we're forced to work in, right? So you have to consider it.
Yeah, and obviously this is people having different practices and different spaces, but when I think about the context of here, we have gallery spaces, not just we don't have Jodi.
It's okay, girl. Get it.
I have to remember this recorded. No, but
Picture and them need a man. Let's go.
No, what I was gonna say, The honesty is, if we had like multiple national institutions that was doing curatorial work where you could be vulnerable and you could be honest and you could take the risk, and the work could then be contextualized to a point where you as the artist are protected by the curator, then I think that that's a different, you then open the door for a different level of like honesty and vulnerability in the totality of the work, because it's inherently protected by the institution. But if you are working in commercial spaces, you have to be, and this is why people have multiple practices, you have to be selective about what you're being honest about because of how the work is then going to be consumed. Because the point of having the work in, you know, a commercial space is not necessary. Like, we do a beautiful job here at contextualizing the work, doing these talks and having like, you know, like rigorous, like
thoughtful engagement.
Yeah, engagement and thoughtful engagement around it, because we're just like great people. But yeah, but I think like in contexts outside of here, I think it's, you just have to figure out what part of the art making process you want to be honest about, and then just incite your right to opacity as a Caribbean person, and just go on. So I think that what I find beautiful in like Heino's practice is so opaque.
Yeah.
It's so opaque. But
he's not trying to be understood by people. He's trying to have a conversation, but not necessarily trying to be understood.
But his approach is so honest. Like, there's
Facts.
nothing about that the way that he makes work that is dishonest to who he is. And it is vulnerable because there's so much failure, and not failure from the work is unsuccessful, but failure in regards to like trying to make the thing work that is in the work. And I think to honor that vulnerability in that, I think is okay. In the same vein as like the vulnerability and like, and I hate to do this, but like in my work where I would do a performance where I like strip and put on clothes for like 24 hours, you know what I mean? Like that was done at the NAGB because the NAGB protected me. I would never do that at Turn. And not to say that Turn wouldn't protect me, but like
different
I just,
spaces, different contexts.
Right. So I think it's that balance. It's like audience, institution, context, and being okay with how this thing will live outside of you, because it is outside of you.
Beautiful. Thank you. No, not rant. That was perfect. That was beautiful.
I just wanted to say thank you, ladies, so much. I think you did a beautiful job of kind of doing this panel. I just want to introduce myself. If you don't know, I'm Averia Wright. I'm the curator of this exhibition. But I just wanted to add for Christina, also a question that I've been taught. I'm a practicing artist as well, and that I've been taught to ask myself as an artist, a practicing artist, is who gave you the right to tell this story? Like, what do you feel that you own about this thing to tell this story? And you kind of have to always ask yourself that question as you're making the work. So
beautifully put.
The honesty will definitely come, because you're going to knock up some real things when you are starting to do the work. I love that you brought up performance art. I did a performance piece before. I did not do this in front of anybody, because like you say, you'd have to be protected. But I did this piece, and I put myself, I think you guys saw it in the NE10, where I was completely covered in straw. And I printed that on fabric. And so I had to literally get in this suit. It was just me and a friend. And she inked my body. And I rolled onto the surface on the floor. And I was inside this thing. And the piece is called Straw Cocoon. And I was in tears. And I feel like your work should bring that kind of emotion. Not every time. Sorry, you don't need to be super emotional. I'm a Cancer, sorry. But for me, your work should be kind of so allow you to get to that place of vulnerability that you kind of like ask more questions. And if you have all the answers, sometimes that ain't honest.
Right. Because then why are you investigating this?
Right.
What's the purpose?
What's the purpose?
If all the questions are answered, why are you doing it?
Exactly. And if you're just going off of somebody else's practice and you're saying, okay, this is popular right now, I'm going to do that, you probably need to question that, investigate why that is you're doing what you're doing.
And you lose every time. You lose because it always looks like you're trying something rather than doing something. You know what I mean?
Right. So yeah, thank you ladies so much.
Thank you too, Averia. Beautiful show. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Unless there's any last stragglers for questions, I think we're good. Do you have one? Yeah? Okay, go on. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that brings us to the end of our... Oh, you had a question?
One last one.
One more.
Can you speak to the significance of the drummers, and if you feel like there's any sort of spiritual thing that's kind of put into that, because they do feel separate but also a part of the piece?
It feels like they're inserted in the landscape, right?
Yeah, it feels kind of like they're not there, but they're there.
I think that's because they're also like, I feel like he's taken like sort of their figures from another image, put them in somewhere as well, which kind of adds to that. But like in that sense, and like I'm glad you mentioned like the sort of spiritual, because it feels kind of spectral and ghost-like. It feels like an echo of something. You know what I mean? That's kind of interesting for me anyway. That's how it kind of works, I guess. But I hadn't thought of it in that way until you mentioned that.
For me, my art history brain turns on in that title, Downtown. So like in that close-up of the two boys playing that drum, they are the center of downtown. They're the center of that painting, not the buildings, not the police officers in the background, but them playing those drums. So Natalie is referencing that spiritual. I think there's something there more to investigate, more to ask questions about. Like what about that is the center of this place, not everything else going on around it.
I love that, especially when like in the context of like, you know, House of Parliament is just these two little boys and they drum is actually like, that's the main thing happening, not everybody else and all the colonial history and trauma and heaviness in the background. Interesting. I like that.
I also think it's disruptive as well.
Facts.
Like the like reverberation of sound, like these two little boys playing, like what does it mean for them to be? And then there's another work where they are there and the police officers are around them while they're in this garden. So yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a beautiful reflection, and I think it goes back to Ricardo's whimsy, you know, his whimsy, but also his criticality. And I think that that's something that we don't quite give him his flowers for. He's quite critical. So if you think of like what happens with Junkanoo in the day as well to these buildings, these two little boys who won't be, if you think about the traditional like drum section of Junkanoo, they wouldn't be playing by themselves. They'd be in the midst of a larger grouping because, you know, there's those permits. So I think and I also think it's something about like the little drummer boy. This kind of like innocence, this playfulness, the drums also being bigger than them. So
innocence tied to nostalgia as well, because we're always trying to get back to a place where we had our innocence and things like that as well.
For sure.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Really, really appreciate it. I know it was rainy. It was doing things. Grateful for your presence. Thank you. And thank you to The Current.
Yeah, you can turn them off. And if you want to, so the show is downstairs in the Current Gallery. It'll be open until 10 p.m. if you want to view the show in person. Thank you again for coming, and we hope you have a good evening.